I think the main reason for starting to make The Perfect Opera was because I was frustrated with a lot of new comic opera I was seeing, which partly had issues because it was very rooted in opera's comedic tradition, which goes all the way back to opera buffa, which goes all the way back to medieval commedia dell'arte. We live in a very, very different world. In the past 200 years, we've had 2 world wars, arguably 4 industrial revolutions, and 9 versions of France. It's time for a change in what opera does. I think the other thing which I really found frustrating in a lot of newer comic opera was it felt that it wasn't okay just to be funny. There wasn't sufficient justification to it. It always had a point. There was always a moment where suddenly the comedy stopped and it was, hello, this is actually really sad when you think about it. The idea that comedy is sad when you think about it is kind of beginner level information. Yeah, comedy's sad when you think about it. That's why it's funny. It's also worth mentioning that a lot of the jokes you would see in these new comic operas were very much about how grotesque something was. It was always the same tone of comedy of it's just so ugly that it's kind of funny but mostly just very bleak, rather than what a lot of very good dark comedy does, because there's some fantastic dark comedy out there, which is that you do mix up the tone. The other thing which I really wanted to do with this opera was to kind of take opera down a size and really unpick its tradition, partly because, of course, opera is obsessed with its traditions like few other art forms. When opera learns from other forms, it does tend to do so by means of appropriating them, and ultimately you then end up with just this sort of little flavouring of whether that's jazz music, pop, horror, but ultimately it's still opera doing something else. I wanted to make a sketch comedy opera where both elements were very actively a part of the overall show. And then when you see new work, it does tend to be on the fringe, or it tends to be in a stylistic language which has evolved very much since World War II. Before World War II particularly, there's this huge tradition of comic opera, of opera that's just entertainment. And all of these works, they're there so you have an entertaining evening out for pretty much anyone, particularly the middle classes and upper classes, but generally anyone could go and enjoy them. And then there's also this tradition of very intellectual work. After World War II, however, what ends up happening is that people go, that was really bad and we need to be serious all the time because humanity is awful, which is entirely justifiable. But it means that you end up with musical theatre and pop music have this very strong tradition of light music, and opera itself ends up being very serious. It evolves a language that's very intellectual, and by the time we get to now, in 2019, that language has branched off so far from the mainstream of what the average person in the street might listen to, that it is essentially its own musical language, which anyone could learn, but your average punter in the street doesn't have time to learn it before they come to a show, and therefore that average punter comes to the show and goes, I don't like it because it's unfamiliar and strange. And I wanted to avoid that. I wanted to create something in a language that was open to everyone, because that's what opera used to do, and it seems like a really valuable thing to do. If you want to speak to everyone, you've got to use their language.